The 1965 Dodge D100 may appear today as a charming relic from an era when trucks were simple, mechanical, and honest, but behind all the nostalgia, there were flaws that owners whispered about but almost no one had the courage to expose. The truck had a strong presence on the road, a bold design, and a reputation among Mopar loyalists, yet it carried a set of imperfections that frustrated drivers in silence. Many enthusiasts today romanticize the D100 as if it were flawless, as if American engineering in the mid-1960s operated under some magic rule that prevented mistakes. But the truth is far more complicated. The truck had beauty, character, and soul, but it also had issues that mechanics in small shops would complain about while wiping grease from their hands, and that owners would hide because admitting the truth meant accepting that their beloved machine wasn't perfect. These were the kinds of problems that didn't ruin the truck, but they made living with it a constant mix of admiration and irritation. One of the earliest frustrations owners experienced came not from the engine or chassis but from the truck's unpredictable road behavior. Drivers loved the rugged stance of the D100, its boxy confidence, and its ability to haul loads without hesitation. But the moment they pushed it beyond calm, straight roads, the weaknesses in its handling became impossible to ignore. The truck rode on suspension geometry that felt outdated even by 1965 standards, with leaf springs that transmitted every vibration into the cabin and steering that demanded strength, patience, and constant corrections. Owners sometimes joked that driving the D100 felt like guiding a stubborn mule down a dirt path, and there was some truth in that humor. The steering box wore out faster than expected, especially on trucks used for heavy work, and once were set in, the wheel developed large amounts of play. Some drivers would turn the wheel 2 or 3 inches before the truck reacted, and this imprecision made highway driving exhausting. There were stories of people gripping the wheel so tightly on long trips that their knuckles turned white, not because the truck was fast or dangerous, but because the steering felt more like a suggestion than a command. The D100 could be controlled, yes, but never lightly, never effortlessly, and never without a sense of tension. Another source of quiet frustration was the truck's braking system. Drum brakes on all 4 wheels were standard at the time, yet even within that context, the D100's braking performance felt inconsistent. Fade was common after descending hills or stopping repeatedly in traffic, and some drivers learned to anticipate danger long before it appeared, simply because the truck needed a surprising amount of distance to come to a complete stop. When carrying a heavy load, the brakes struggled even more, causing the truck to pull slightly to one side or vibrate through the pedal. For a tool meant for work, this was a problem that owners rarely admitted. No one wanted to confess that their strong, reliable American pickup sometimes felt vulnerable under pressure. In rural towns, mechanics often advised owners to downshift and use engine braking whenever possible, and the fact that this advice had to be given so frequently showed how deeply the issue was felt. It wasn't a catastrophic flaw, but it was a flaw that demanded respect. Owners had to plan their driving, anticipate slopes, and keep more distance than modern drivers could imagine. The brakes worked, until they didn't, and this unpredictability made the truck secretly intimidating in situations where safety depended on quick reactions. The cabin of the 1965 D100 may look charming in photos today, with its simple instrument cluster, metallic dash, and wide bench seat, but the experience inside was far from comfortable. Noise, heat, and vibration dominated the cabin, creating an atmosphere that modern drivers would consider nearly hostile. The firewall and floor had minimal insulation, allowing engine heat to seep into the truck on long drives, making summer trips a sweaty ordeal. At idle, the cabin filled with a mixture of mechanical sounds, the rhythmic ticking of the valve train, the hum of the transmission, and the dull drone of the fuel pump. On the road, wind noise entered through poorly sealed doors, and the combination of engine roar and road vibration made many drivers leave the cabin feeling physically tired. These sensations were normal in mid-1960s trucks, but the D100 seemed to amplify them. The metal surfaces inside the cabin acted like resonating plates, turning small vibrations into noticeable shaking. Some owners padded their dashboards or added aftermarket insulation just to reduce the harshness. Even then, silence inside the D100 was impossible. People who drove the truck daily learned to embrace the noise, to treat it as part of its personality. But for those who expected comfort or refinement, The cabin was a reminder that the D100 was built for work, not for peace. Another issue that frustrated owners was the truck's inconsistent build quality. Dodge, during the 1960s, was still developing a more modern manufacturing approach, and the assembly of the D100 reflected both the strengths and weaknesses of the era. Some trucks rolled out of the factory feeling tight and well put together, while others had misaligned panels, rattling doors, or electrical quirks that appeared within the first few months of ownership. The wiring harness, in particular, was known for developing loose connections, causing headlights or interior gauges to behave erratically. Dealers often blamed these issues on rough use, even when the trucks were brand new. Enthusiasts today sometimes talk about the D100 as if every unit was built with perfect craftsmanship, but old mechanics know better. They remember repainting panels that left the factory with thin coats, hammering door frames to achieve proper alignment, and tracking down mysterious electrical faults that seemed to come and go without explanation. These problems didn't stop the truck from functioning, but they chipped away at the confidence of owners who expected dependability. Many kept quiet about these frustrations because admitting build issues felt like questioning the entire brand, and no loyal Dodge owner wanted to be seen doing that. Perhaps the most controversial issue, and one that few people talk about even today, was the truck's fuel economy. The D100 was powered by engines that were strong, durable, and dependable, but also thirsty. Even with careful driving, owners struggled to achieve economical fuel consumption. In an era when gas was cheap, this wasn't necessarily a financial burden, but it was still a point of annoyance. The 225/6 engine, despite its reputation for longevity, didn't offer the efficiency many expected from a smaller displacement engine. When paired with the truck's weight, gearing, and aerodynamics that resembled a brick, the fuel consumption often surprised first-time owners. Those who chose the V8 enjoyed better torque but suffered even worse fuel economy. People rarely complained openly about this issue because everyone understood that trucks weren't meant to be economical, but deep down, many drivers felt that the D100 consumed more fuel than necessary. As the truck aged and fuel prices eventually began to rise in later decades, this flaw became even more apparent. It didn't ruin the experience, but it made daily use more expensive and pushed some owners to limit how often they drove the truck. Living with the 1965 Dodge D100 was an emotional experience. On one hand, there was pride in driving something American, mechanical, and undeniably tough. On the other hand, there was a mixture of patience and resignation, because the truck demanded effort, tolerance, and sometimes forgiveness. Owners loved the D100 because it symbolized freedom, work, and resilience, but they also quietly struggled with the flaws that came with it. The problems were not dramatic or catastrophic, but they shaped the way people interacted with the truck. They influenced how drivers approached long trips, how mechanics planned repairs, and how families talked about the vehicle during gatherings. The truck's identity was built not only on its strengths but also on these small but persistent imperfections that made ownership a unique challenge. Despite all these issues, many owners kept their D100 for years, refusing to replace it with newer or more comfortable trucks. They formed a connection with the machine, a bond built through shared struggles. The flaws became familiar, almost endearing. Drivers learned to anticipate the steering's hesitation, to compensate for the brake's unpredictability, to endure the cabin's harshness, and to laugh about the fuel consumption. These flaws made the truck imperfect, but they also made it unforgettable. And perhaps that is why so few people dared to reveal the truth. Admitting the truck's flaws meant acknowledging that something they loved deeply had cracks in its foundation. Loyalty made them silent, nostalgia made them protective, and pride kept them from telling the full story. Yet the truth remains. The 1965 Dodge D100 was not a perfect machine. It was a product of its time, built with limitations, compromises, and quirks that shaped the driving experience in ways that modern enthusiasts often overlook. For some, these flaws were enough to frustrate them daily. For others, the flaws were simply part of the charm, a reminder that real machines, especially those built in the golden age of American automotive history, carry both strengths and weaknesses. The first step to appreciating the D100 fully is acknowledging the problems that owners were reluctant to share. Only then can the truck be seen for what it truly was, a vehicle with character, complexity, and a story far richer than the nostalgic photographs and polished restorations suggest. Owners of the 1965 Dodge D100 who kept the truck for decades often learned that its imperfections revealed themselves slowly, changing character as the truck aged. A flaw that seemed minor in the first year of ownership could evolve into a serious inconvenience after a decade of use. For many drivers, the truck became almost like a living companion, aging, developing quirks, requiring patience, and demanding constant attention. In these long-term relationships, some issues became almost legendary, whispered between owners at local gatherings or mentioned quietly at repair shops. Few wanted to publicly admit that their beloved D100 suffered from these weaknesses, but everyone who lived with the truck long enough eventually encountered them. One of the long-term frustrations came from the manual transmissions commonly equipped in the D100. The gearbox was durable, built from thick metal, and designed to take abuse from daily work, but over time, it developed a tendency to become stiff and stubborn. Cold mornings were especially difficult, with the shifter resisting movement as if frozen in place. The synchros wore down faster than expected, causing gears to clash or grind unless the driver shifted with almost delicate precision. Many owners learned a very specific rhythm: push the clutch, pause, move the shifter gently, wait for the gears to align, and only then complete the motion. It was a ritual that required patience, and those who rushed the process were greeted with grinding sounds that echoed through the cabin like a reminder of the truck's age. Some mechanics recommended double clutching even in normal driving, a technique that belonged more to the world of heavy trucks than light pickups. Drivers never boasted about this flaw, because admitting it made the truck sound fragile, and no one wanted their D100 to be seen as anything other than strong. Another quiet frustration involved the electrical system. As the D100 aged, the wiring harness, already known for inconsistencies from the factory, became even more prone to issues. Wires hardened, connectors corroded, and the fuse box became a source of mystery. Lights would flicker intermittently, gauges would come alive one moment and fall silent the next, and the charging system sometimes behaved unpredictably. The ammeter gauge in particular was infamous for giving misleading readings, causing owners to worry unnecessarily about battery or alternator problems. At night, some drivers experienced moments when the headlights dimmed suddenly while the engine load changed, creating a sense of unease on dark rural roads. Others reported that the dash lights were so faint that they practically disappeared, forcing them to drive half-blind. These electrical quirks rarely left the truck completely inoperable, but they created an environment where trust was constantly tested. Owners carried spare fuses, extra wiring, and even makeshift tools in the glove box, ready to address issues whenever they arose. But despite all this preparation, few ever confessed openly that their beloved Dodge suffered from these unpredictable electrical ghosts. Rust was another quiet enemy of the D100, especially in regions with humid climates or salted winter roads. While the truck's frame was relatively strong, certain areas were notorious for corrosion: the wheel arches, the door bottoms, the floor pans, and the edges of the hood. Many trucks that looked solid on the outside were hiding rot beneath layers of paint. Owners often tried to patch rust discreetly, applying filler or welding small plates without discussing the true extent of the damage. In the 1960s and 70s, rust was considered a normal part of vehicle ownership, but the D100 seemed particularly vulnerable around seam lines and drain channels that clogged easily. Water accumulated silently, trapped behind panels, eating away the metal slowly. By the time most owners noticed, the corrosion had already spread. Body shops in rural towns became experts at repairing D100s because so many of them required frequent intervention. Yet even among enthusiasts, discussing rust felt like admitting defeat, as if acknowledging that the truck wasn't as invincible as its image suggested. Silence became a shield that protected the truck's reputation, even though everyone knew rust was quietly winning the battle. The heating and ventilation system offered another layer of frustration. In cold weather, the heater either took an unusually long time to warm up or suddenly flooded the cabin with uncomfortable heat, lacking any precise regulation. The controls were basic and imprecise, often sticking or requiring excessive force. Some drivers complained that the heater core developed leaks over time, causing coolant smells to fill the cabin and fog the windows on humid mornings. Ventilation in hot weather was even worse. The truck relied heavily on windows for airflow, but because the cabin heated up so quickly from engine warmth and sun exposure, summer driving could feel like sitting inside a metal box with limited relief. The window regulators themselves often became stiff or misaligned, making the simple act of rolling down a window strangely difficult. Drivers adapted to these issues, opening vent windows, wearing lighter clothing, or simply enduring the discomfort. But no one ever advertised these inconveniences, because doing so made the truck sound outdated and unrefined, two words Dodge owners never wanted associated with their machine. The bench seat, despite its classic appearance, also became a source of hidden dissatisfaction over time. Its padding compressed with age, its springs weakened, and the vinyl surface cracked under harsh sunlight. Long trips often left drivers with sore backs, and the lack of lateral support made sharp turns feel exaggerated. The seat's position also contributed to the awkward steering experience, forcing drivers to lean forward slightly to maintain control on winding roads. Many owners added homemade cushions, folded blankets, or aftermarket pads to improve comfort, but they rarely admitted publicly that the seat design was flawed. Saying the bench seat was uncomfortable felt like insulting an icon, so most people preferred to say they got used to it, even though comfort was rarely achieved. Another subtle flaw that changed ownership over time involved the engine mounts. As the rubber aged, it hardened or cracked, causing increased vibration throughout the truck. Under load, the engine sometimes shifted slightly, transmitting noticeable shuddering into the cabin. In severe cases, worn mounts caused misalignment issues that affected the drivetrain. For a machine celebrated for its mechanical durability, admitting that something as simple as an engine mount could create ongoing problems felt embarrassing to some owners. They replaced the mounts quietly, without mentioning that the truck's smoothness depended heavily on a small component that aged more quickly than it should have. One of the most overlooked frustrations involved parts availability in the decades that followed the truck's production. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, finding certain components became increasingly difficult. Dodge did not maintain the same level of aftermarket support as other manufacturers, and parts for older trucks often disappeared from shelves. Owners had to rely on scrapyards, fabrication, or creative improvisation to keep their D100s running. Mechanical components like clutches, steering parts, and suspension bushings remained available for longer, but smaller components such as trim pieces, interior parts, and electrical connectors became rare. Even today, restorers face challenges sourcing original parts in good condition. Yet few long-term owners complained about this publicly because doing so felt like admitting the truck was becoming obsolete. Instead, they celebrated their ability to improvise, reinforcing the idea that Dodge owners were resourceful and tough, even when the truth was that they simply had no choice. Another frustration that shaped ownership was the truck's gearing. Many D100s were equipped with rear axle ratios designed for hauling rather than highway cruising. This meant that at modern speeds, the engine revved higher than ideal, creating noise, heat, and unnecessary fuel consumption. The truck could drive on the highway, but it never felt comfortable there. Long trips became exercises in endurance, with drivers constantly monitoring temperature, listening to engine pitches, and hoping the noise wouldn't become overwhelming. Swapping to more highway-friendly gearing was possible, but not common in the truck's early years, and many owners simply accepted the limitations. They learned to drive slower, stay in the right lane, and avoid long journeys when possible. This issue was rarely mentioned openly because admitting that the D100 struggled with high-speed travel made it sound weak, and no owner wanted to spread that perception. As the truck aged further, maintenance became a ritual that only dedicated owners embraced fully. The D100 demanded regular lubrication, frequent checks of its mechanical components, and careful monitoring of minor issues before they became major. Owners who ignored these needs quickly found themselves facing expensive repairs. Yet even those who took meticulous care of their trucks sometimes faced unexpected failures. Fuel pumps wore out, carburetors developed leaks or clogged jets, and exhaust manifolds cracked under repeated heat cycles. These problems were not unique to Dodge, but they contributed to the perception that the truck required more maintenance than its competitors. Still, owners rarely spoke of these frustrations, preferring to highlight the truck's strengths rather than its susceptibilities. Despite all these flaws, something remarkable happened. The 1965 Dodge D100 developed a loyal community of enthusiasts who loved the truck not in spite of its imperfections, but because of them. The flaws made the truck human in a strange way. Its unpredictability created stories, its quirks became memories, and its challenges fostered a deep sense of accomplishment whenever repairs were completed successfully. Owners bonded over shared struggles, forming a culture that valued toughness, patience, and authenticity. The D100 became more than a vehicle, it became a companion with personality, one that demanded attention and rewarded loyalty. Even today, when restorers bring these trucks back to life, they often speak about the flaws with a mix of frustration and affection. They acknowledge the issues with the steering, the suspension, the brakes, and the noise, but they also smile when describing the satisfaction of hearing the slant six come to life or seeing the truck stand tall after decades of work. The imperfections that once annoyed owners now serve as reminders of a different era, an era when vehicles were built with metal, sweat, and intention. The flaws did not destroy the D100's legacy, they shaped it. They made the truck unique, authentic, and emotionally powerful. In the end, the truth about the 1965 Dodge D100 is not that it was a flawed truck pretending to be great. It was a great truck that carried its flaws openly, waiting for owners who could appreciate its complexity. The problems nobody dared to reveal were not secrets meant to hide shame, they were realities that contributed to the truck's character. Owning a D100 meant embracing its strengths and weaknesses equally, understanding that perfection was never the goal. The truck was built to work, to endure, and to leave a legacy defined not by flawless engineering but by resilience. This resilience is what kept the D100 on the road for decades, and what continues to attract enthusiasts who value honesty over glamour. The flaws may have frustrated owners, but they also created a bond that modern trucks rarely inspire. They made every mile memorable, every repair meaningful, and every moment behind the wheel a reminder that true automotive icons are not defined by perfection but by presence. The 1965 Dodge D100 had presence, raw, unapologetic, and unforgettable. And that, more than anything else, is why its story continues to be told, even by those who once stayed silent about the truths hidden beneath its metal skin.